Once you have your sculpture in a place so you feel comfortable, a good idea is to bring a simple render into a program like Photoshop and start to sketch out some costume ideas. On the simple thumbnails that I did earlier, I had some indication of costume, but I really haven't resolved what I wanted it to be just yet. So a really fun new feature that Photoshop has is the symmetry mode. So I rendered out a front view of the character, and I'm just going to start putting in some simple tones and coming up with an idea for where this costume might go. I'm not going to think about color or detail at this stage, just the main beats that I want to make sure that this costume has reading. You can see here I'm just sketching in some sort of strapping and some form of armor, and I knew I wanted him to have that big collar. He has that long neck, so I thought the collar would be kind of fun. A big part of this style of costuming, I feel like, is strapping and belts, bandoliers, things like that will be visually interesting and also add a little bit to their character. Some other random greebly kind of ideas for detailing I wanted to throw in there. Sometimes when you're doing these costumes, you want to have every idea figured out. Why is there something on there? And other times, detail is nice just to add to break up a little visual interest. So we talked about it with sculpting. Same is true with costuming. You want to have areas of rest. You want to have moments where you don't have so much detail that it all becomes visual noise. This can be done by simple detailing. It can also be done by grouping materials together and making it as easy to understand as possible. When you're doing costuming for a character like this, you're thinking more about what makes a utilitarian idea, but you also want to be thinking a little bit about aesthetics. So he has certain anatomy features that I might want to focus on. The long arms, the long neck. Also balancing out some of his more alien features in the face. So playing with the idea of maybe adding gloves to him. And this is the place where you want to toy around with these ideas. You can be very, very free here. You don't have to be worried about how long it's going to take to make something. You can simply sketch out a quick cape or duster over the character or some sort of armor piece. Doing this in 3D takes a lot longer, as you're about to see. So I have a rough idea, and I'm going to jump into ZBrush now. Using masking on our finished character, I shouldn't say finished, on our character that has the new topology, I can start to extract pieces off and use them as costume elements. So I've grabbed a chunk of his body, and I've gone a little further than what we did in our sketch by adding the sleeve area. Sometimes I'll add more than I'm anticipating just in case I want to add it. It's not difficult to add later, but it's easier to remove. So I've extracted out the body, and by default, that's going to come out with a shell, kind of a inside, outside, and edge. I've deleted the edge and the inside and closed the holes, so it's a solid object now. The reason I recommend doing that when you're figuring out your costume is this allows you to push and pull into your mesh and develop the ideas without worrying too much about what's happening on both sides. If we need to at a later date, we could actually very easily make a thin shell or cloth out of this. So just like before, we want to think about those big forms, those what we're calling the primary forms. So for him, the main beats are going to be his big collar, his armor pieces, the shoulder area, and figuring out just the length that we want to go for this character. He's primarily a bust, but we do have a bit of a waist on him just so we can show a bit more of the costume. So I'm going to mask out around where I think the chest armor should be. And just using that clay brush with the square alpha, I'm going to block in a little bit of machined kind of hard surface idea. I'm also going to use the H polish brush. So here's a new brush I don't think we've used too much to simplify some of the chunkier bits. Once I know I don't need those sleeves anymore, I can just hide and delete them and then fill the holes again. We're going to speed through this a bit because at this point, although I have a quick sketch that I'm going off of, I'm also still resolving the design, and this process is pretty repetitive. So you notice that I'm doing everything on one piece. I don't have separated out armors, I don't have separated out straps or belts. I find it a lot easier to think of all of this as one big 3D sketch as opposed to being too careful with everything. When you don't have a lot of time, you can actually resolve this to a point that is very presentable. For the purposes of our demo here, I'm going to show you a variety of ways that I would handle making a costume for a character. All of these are ways I use in production, depending on the time allowed and also just what the needs are. So I'm starting to add a little bit of the detail now. This is going to show the breakup on the shoulder pads, the collar area, the strapping idea that I have to go over the armor. And then just starting to resolve the simple detail. Nothing being done here is absolute. And you'll see that I'm not undoing a lot of times, but I am smoothing or using the H polish brush to wipe away ideas that don't work as well. Building out a little bit more of the integration of the collarbone. And by masking areas and pushing and pulling them, I'm able to really add a nice bit of separation. The H polish brush is used a lot at this stage just to integrate everything. I don't want it all to feel that it's just gums sculpted on top of itself, but I also don't want it to feel like it's too separated. So I'm going to do something a little strange here. There's a brush here, the Curve Strap Snap Surface. And by using this, you can just draw simple lines. And you'll see they connect in between from strap to strap. I'm just getting rid of the snap distance so that it does not continue the line anymore. I forgot to set the thickness on this, but I knew it wouldn't really matter because I was just going to extract the surface later on anyway. Another way to approach this type of costume element is just to insert a sphere and mash it around to get it to where you want, and then mask out and extract. And in fact, we're actually going to do that later on. So you see I have a different color combination here. This is something I was playing with, but decided to go with the blue. One of the nice things about this approach is you can quickly sketch a lot of different costume ideas without being committed to a big time commitment. So now I'm adding in a little bit more refined detail. At this stage, you could go to a very, very nice polished look if you wanted to. For the purposes of what we're going to do, I want to get it to a place where I understand what's happening for this whole costume. Versatility is really important at this stage. You may be working on a quick costume and then rendering this out in Photoshop, doing a bunch of variations, and getting notes from your supervisor before you commit to anything further. So though it's all one piece, I'm still thinking about what's happening underneath these different layers. How those straps might interact with the under jacket. And although it's all one material at this point, I am thinking about the different material breakups, which we'll be adding in shortly. Not sold on the belt idea at this stage, but I've sketched it in, so for now we're going to keep it. That ribbing idea that we mentioned earlier, all the way back to the reference, is something I really want to enforce as we move forward as well. This process can take a while, or it can go very quick depending on the time that you have. Sometimes a very simple sculpt like this can actually be brought into a program like Keyshot and look really presentable a lot faster than you might expect. But as with anything, the more time you spend on something, the better you're going to be able to get it to look. So always thinking of the proportions. It's easy to lose sight of that as you keep working. The nice thing about having this as a separate subtool is I can mash it around, find out where the most interesting simple drape would go. I'm just using that pinch tool to kind of bring it all together. And if you remember earlier, we used the extrude features by holding Control and dragging. I'm doing that again here to elongate that side of the cape. And I just pushed in that vest area a little bit so you could see a little bit more of his skin underneath. This process is evolving, so as I'm developing this costume, since I'm working in 3D, I'm able to decide if I like the overall idea. Sometimes from one angle, just like we were doing earlier, you'll realize maybe this doesn't work as well as I wanted it to. And since we're keeping things loose, we can quickly change it on the fly. So at this point, we have a rough sculpt, and now we need to start differentiating out the material breakup. So all I'm going to do is have MRGB mode on when I'm painting, which means I'm painting material and color. And I'll mask out the sections and just fill them or paint over them. And here we are jumped ahead because that process takes a little while. It gets quicker the more you do. So I'm keeping the color breakup real simple, and I knew I wanted to go with these kind of earthy tones. Feel they look nice with the skin color we chose to go with. But the colors and materials in ZBrush really won't matter too much. Once we get this into Keyshot, we can completely change these things in a lot of different ways. I do like to make the ZBrush model and the Keyshot model feel fairly similar, though. It'd be a little jarring when you jump back and forth if they go too different. The most important thing is that you have different materials on each piece. And I'm just looking for any areas where I can bring in the secondary reads of what's going on underneath. We'll do a refined version of this where we actually start to separate all these pieces out as well. But at this stage, you have to be thinking through the object. I know I'm not going to show much of the back, but it's a good idea to have something kind of blocked out back there. And here we are almost ready to go into Keyshot. Just want to give a few little settings on, so I'm going to turn on Keyshot and merge. So here's usually what you see once you send your object over. Might be out of size. So I'm going to make the environment size bigger. And I'm just going to find one of the default HDRI maps to toss in there. And if I rotate it around, you can see how the lighting affects it. But by default, you have no reflection or specularity on your ZBrush materials. So you need to add a little bit of specular to it. And I don't want it to look like he's soaking wet, so I'm going to add a little bit of roughness to that. I also like to add some lighting that I can control from Keyshot, as opposed to just the HDRI maps. So for this one, I'm going to use a spotlight. And the settings here are really object dependent and mood dependent. So to make sure I can kind of understand what that light is doing, I'm going to knock the environment back to just a simple color. Play with the camera angle a little. And by turning the brightness down, I can see what that light that I've added is actually doing. A fun feature is you can change the pivot to any object in your scene. So I'm using the eyes right now to rotate it around. It's just a little easier than having to zoom out and see where the light actually exists. And here I've duplicated the light. You do want to be a little careful. I believe if you add too many of these custom lights, render times can go up. But my computer is pretty strong, so I shouldn't have too much of a problem. The matte cap feature on the ZBrush materials can be really useful sometimes, and it might not look good others. So you can always play with that and see if you like the way it looks or not. So I've sent over the entire character now with the costume, and I've applied some simple materials to it. At a later chapter, I'm going to go into material breakdown and how to make pretty cool materials, so I'm not going to talk too much about that at this stage. What I do want to say, though, is once you're comfortable with this pipeline, you're able to bring it in at any stage and render out something that you can bring into Photoshop to make design options off of. So I'm just sampling the colors from the render, and I'm looking at what I don't like or what I do like. I do like the idea of this being kind of a painted metal, and I can see that I really need to reinforce some of the detailing that I've sculpted into this costume, which we're going to get into very shortly. So I might do something like this before I present it to a supervisor. If I had the time, I might pose him out and do some sort of more moody image. Or I might just do this for myself to see if I like where I'm going with the overall idea. Again, it's very time dependent. I want to make that a little more complex and more machined. Early on, I had sketched a secondary piece of armor around the ribs, and I kind of forgot about that when doing the ZBrush sculpt, so I want to reinforce that idea. It'll add a little complexity to the costume, which I think it needs, and also make a little bit more sense. If he's got a soft underneath and he's got this hard shell on top, he would need something in between. I want to bring those colors up too, because once you put real lighting on things, they can quickly fade away. And I'm finding ways to bring the colors all around. So the shoulder pads, I added the piping lower on his costuming, and a little bit more of a complex material breakup with the ribbing in the center and something more simple on the sides. And I'm still thinking of his overall character too, and playing with the idea of maybe a tattoo on the arm. Once again, always evolving this. Adding a little bit more detail to the cloak area. It's almost in a way like taking notes for yourself. Things you want to do or things you don't like. And when you're comfortable enough in a program like ZBrush, you can very quickly go back and just redo these changes. So I can see where I want to go with this now. And a big part of it's going to be in separating out this armor. So the previous process you saw I might do for a first pass, maybe even up to a second pass. But once things are moving along, it's a good idea to start resolving this stuff. This might be going to a VFX house, this might be going to a costumer, and the more that you understand what you've made and the more information you can pass on, the more use you're going to be to the team. So I've split off the chest area, and I've now Dynameshed it together. I'm not worrying about the detail, because I didn't spend that long on it before, and after our paint over, I know I'm going to do some changes here. So this is a kind of a continuation of where we were before, but just a little bit more precise. A little more thought is going to go into this stage. I'll worry a bit more about edges. I'll worry a bit more about overlaps. The nice thing about the previous process is that when we get into posing, it's much easier because it's all one piece. The more complex your characters get, the harder posing gets. But we will talk about some tricks in terms of posing characters with complex costumes toward the end of this class. So I'm using the clay brushes to bulk areas out that I want to feel overlapped, and then the polish brushes to bring them back down. I'm using the transpose tools to flatten areas out. I'm using the dam standard and the standard brush to scribe in some detail lines. Again, these are not final details. These are mental notes for myself on my little digital clay here. I wish I could say I had some great hard surface trick for sculpting hard surface, but I honestly find it very similar to doing organic sculpting, or actually even more similar to doing stylized characters. The big difference is you really want to play with your planes and make sure they read nicely. A nice new feature in ZBrush is the live Boolean feature, and we're going to use that briefly just to kind of cut out some more machined areas. With this, I can insert any geometry I want. In this case, I'm just going to use a simple cube. I'm going to split it off into its own piece. And by setting that to cutaway, it will actually be removed from any object that I have. As you can see, it's going into our character. So to stop that from happening, a few things you can do. You could hide that stuff if you want, or you could make it, you can separate each piece out by adding a start option per subtool. Here I'm going to add a little bit of detailing to the center area where that kind of ventilation part is. Some of the new tools in ZBrush are controlled by the transform gizmo, and they have this interesting cone system. I wish I could give you some fantastic answer for what every cone does, but I kind of just have to play with them because it's a pretty confusing system. But once you've done it a few times, you are able to figure it out pretty easy. So I'm going to duplicate this piece over. And you can see here, if you hold Control and drag out, you'll duplicate the object. But as soon as you let go of Control, it'll start to replicate that object the distance that before you let go of Control. I know that sounds a little confusing, but once you've done it again, it makes sense. The nice thing about this is it's fully editable. So if I wanted to move that ventilation later, I could completely change it, whatever I want to do. And although Booleans could be useful here too, sometimes you just want to go in there with a polish brush and your move brush. Once you're happy with it, I usually bake down my Booleans and my sculpt. Again, this isn't for a finished, perfect piece. It's still just kind of a rough idea. It's gotten a little bulbous, so I'm going to shrink it in a little bit. In fact, the overall character has gotten a little pushed out. And we'll control that in a moment. So just using those transpose lines with Alt to kind of warp it around his body a little bit nicer. It shouldn't feel like it's built to his body. The extract we did before of his costume did that by its nature. But if you think about an armor piece, it wouldn't be built like directly off his body form. So now that we've gotten that piece done, we got to think about what's happening underneath. Before we were just kind of imagining it. Now we get to the opportunity to resolve it. So thinking about that piping I sketched in earlier, the ribbing that I wanted to have. I had the indication there that maybe there's some sort of tech underneath this ribbing, and we're going to enhance that a little bit later. Again, thinking a bit about the back. Knowing it's going to be covered up for our final image, I'm not overly concerned, but it's always, the more you do, the less you have to do later. One thing when you're doing character design for film is knowing when to cut corners, and other times is knowing when to do the work. So I'm going to do a quick Z remesh on this piece, just like we did with the body, and project the detail from the costume back on there. This is going to come into play later when we start to pose our character. It's also going to give us a little bit of a higher fidelity sculpt. The Z remeshing technique is so quick. It's really worth doing it when you can. For hard surface, it's a little bit more difficult, and that's where we're going to get into some retopping. Manual retopping, I should say. But at this stage, it's really easy just to use their built-in Z remesher and project the detail back on. If you've never used it before, I do recommend you check out Pixologic's website for information on all the different settings, because there's a lot of fun options you can do with it. I guess fun's the wrong word, but there's a lot of good options you can do with it. Some of them are simply using Alt when you hit the Z remesher will give you a different result, different algorithm. So this time I'm using the topology brush to make some straps. This gives you real control over how many segments you have. So once again, just trying to show another way to approach something. So we've taken this character pretty far with a bunch of different costume options. Editing a character like this can be difficult because you have to keep jumping between your subtools. So I will use the Transpose Master so that I can edit everything at once. So here I'm just masking off his head and his eyes so that I can pull his head and neck up a little bit more. He's getting a little squat. And now I'm looking at the proportion of the head and eyes together. The cranium shape. Now this I could be doing on the other subtools, but it's kind of nice to be able to do it all as one piece. I've done some other minor edits here, and I'm going to send it back. So one little glitch here is my edge loops got, or rather my edge creases got a little messed up here. So I'm using the Z Modeler tool, which is a really complex tool, but it's also very useful. And we'll talk some more about that later as well. But I'm just going in and making sure that my edges have a crease on the sides where I want it to be sharp. Inserting some loops. And the poly strip is nice to use just to differentiate these polygroups, because now I can add a whole different material in that center bit very easily, as opposed to by doing it by hand and painting it. You get some interesting results with your different settings here, but I want this to just be one big piece. So we're just adding a little bit more detail and pushing it all in. And then using the move tool just to pull it out where it starts to penetrate through. So I have this very rough shape for the cloak or the cape, but thickness is all over the place. So by turning on backface masking and masking out the surface that's facing us, the surface I like, I'm going to extract a piece. Now, the problem with that is that I'm going to have these really jagged edges all over the place, which is not the intent. So by using the edge loops and panel loop features, actually the group loop features, I'll throw a little bit of a simplified loop around the whole thing. And when I Z-remesh that, it'll make a nice, clean edge flow. As seen here.